Okay, hello. Good morning, afternoon, good evening to everybody who has joined us, wherever you're calling in from. Thank you for joining Smartling's reality series. This is episode 6, and we are going to be focusing on whether LLMs have mastered the art of translation. I am Kelsey Woodworth, the marketing manager here at Smartling, and I am excited to announce our 2 speakers for today. We have Mei Zhang, senior data scientist at Smartling, and we have Valerie Dehant, who is our Senior Director of Language Services. So thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Cool. So before we dive in, just a couple of things to note. This session is going to be recorded. So if you miss something or you have to leave early, we will be sending the recordings of this later today. And if you have any questions throughout today's session, you'll see in the top right, there's a Q&A tab. So feel free to drop your questions in there and we will address them at the end. So let's go ahead and get started. For our first myth, we're going to be discussing or myth number 1 being LLMs are better than machine translation for translation. May, what do you have to say about that?
I would say they are not yet better than machine translations for translation. And the reason is the fact that large language models, they are not specifically trained for translation. They are trained on recognizing patterns in languages in general. So they're really great at generating the next most probabilistic token, or what we known as words. So what I would say is they are better at general language understanding than they are at translations. But with that said, because large language models are trained to recognize the patterns in languages, I think they are great machine translation add-ons. And by that, I mean that they are good at picking up mistakes in machine translation, such as correcting grammatical errors, rewording the machine translation to make it sound more fluent, etc.
So which solution would you recommend between machine translation or LLM for a localization manager looking to expand their toolkit?
It's a great question. I think that is very client specific. It will depend on the client's size of their translation memory, for example. It would depend on the quality of their linguistic assets, such as glossaries and style guides, as well as who this translation is for, like if there's a need for high quality or low quality, right? So let's break that down step by step. The first one is, if the client has a big enough translation memory and they want their current translation or future translation to adhere strictly to their old translation memory, then I would recommend doing a custom trained neural machine translation, because we are seeing that that is currently the best performing solution for machine translations. If the client has a great style guide in addition to glossary terms, then I will propose large language models with very tailored and specific prompts that incorporates all of that linguistic assets. And we do see that does perform well for certain locales. And if their translation, just needs a translation that doesn't need to be of high quality, doesn't have high impact, then in that case, I think machine translation can do a decent job, just the generic one. Machine translation, they tend to be more accurate, right, to the extent of being too literal, and that's the issue with machine translations. LLMs, on the other hand, they are more fluent, except for the occasional poor choice of words that make them inaccurate as well as unidiomatic, and they do tend to hallucinate and make up words. So I say, pick your poison when it comes to that.
That's what I'm hearing. Basically, the localization manager would need to look at what is their priority, right? Yes. Do they want accurate translation, or do they want something that is more stylistically compelling and more fluent? Both serve a different purpose.
Exactly. So large language models are more fluent, yet less accurate. MTs are more accurate to the extent of being too liberal, yet less fluent. I would say they complement each other very well. But if you're looking for very high quality translation, at the moment, you always need a human in the loop to verify that for you.
Great, thank you. And so moving through, our second myth is you can use LLMs to translate all language pairs. What's the reality for this, May?
Yeah, so the reality is that large language models cannot translate not all large language models can translate into all language pairs. No language model can translate into all language pairs because there's just too many languages in the world. Right now, not all language models are not multilingual. A handful of them are multilingual, but most of the content that they are trained on are all English content, most of them. For those with multilingual support, the quality of that translation also varies because not all of the language models have the same or train on the same amount of content from one language to the other. So they also train on different data. So the outputs are very different from each of these models. Yeah. So the translation quality that you get from them will be all different as well.
And the quality, like the quality of the output for the LLMs also depends on the prompts you use, right? So
yes,
what would be your recommendations for prompts?
So we have been testing some generic prompts with different LLMs. Generic prompts don't seem to work really well. But what we are seeing, what works better is because there's no one prompt fits all, I will recommend that you come in and build your own prompt, which incorporates your company's persona, right? Your style guide, your glossary, the image that your brand wants to present to your target audience. The more specific and tailored this prompt is, the better chance you will have at getting a good translation out of large language models. And right now, what we're hearing from linguists is that while some translations are great with large language models, there are occasionally the cases where it will pick a wrong word in that great translation and makes the whole translation unidiomatic. So this is one of the major issues that we are finding with large language models in general, and this isn't a prompt issue. So there are other issues in addition to finding a good prompt that does good translations. I would say not all the time, but most of the time.
Okay. And so you say it cannot translate into all language pairs. So how do I know which language pair is going to be supported?
Right. So we know that there's a lot of large language models out there. Each of these language models should have a model card that comes with them. And inside the model card, it will list out all of the languages that they support. But like I said before, even though they support a certain language, it doesn't mean that the translation for that language is of good quality. It just means that that model has been trained on a data set that contains that language. Whether or not it's good for your translation use case, that remains an unknown. And that is something that you would have to test with these large language models to find out.
So language models, it's a lot of trial and error for now, right?
Yes, right now we're seeing a lot of trial and error. We do have some guesses as to which language will perform better for translation, for example. And that's, for example, languages that are more widely available on the internet, such as Spanish, Chinese. These are what we call high resource language. For high resource language, you can assume fairly accurately that these language model has seen a large amount of content from these languages to be good at tasks in these languages. However, low resource languages that's not widely available on the internet, for example, like Thai, Viet, these will not perform as well. Yeah.
Cool. And I see a question that's come in from Julia asking, have you tested English, Spanish, and English, Italian? Looks like despite successive machine translation for these language pairs, GPT is not so strong. Do you have any insights to add? Yeah, for these more high resource languages.
So that it comes down to the prompt that you're testing it on. We are seeing that with generic prompts, it is not performing as well in comparison to machine translations. But like I mentioned before, with more specifically tailored prompts, we do see some improvements.
Great. And our third myth for today is LLMs can replace linguists. Valerie, is that a reality or?
Well, it's certainly a question that is top of mind, or a statement that is top of mind for linguists. Will we get replaced? I don't think that day has arrived yet, and we're far from it for now. LLMs still miss quite a few nuances that only linguists can pick up, and we also, as May mentioned earlier, that they hallucinate information from outside of the source content. So you do need to make sure that you have a linguist, professional linguist, looking over the translation to fact check the translation. Was that in the source? Was the nuance from the source actually added to the target text? So the linguist is not going anywhere for now. Is their role changing? Yes, definitely. And when we think about the profession of a translation, we see more and more them playing a role like the co-pilot of AI, and we're definitely going to continue needing them to oversee what the machine is producing. But right now, we continue, we certainly need professional linguists to evaluate the quality and to correct what the machine output is.
So Valerie, what I'm hearing is we do need linguists, but as in a role, as the role evolves and changes into more of a co-pilot for AI, how do you envision linguists being co-pilots for AI?
Well, so there, it's twofold, right? It's first we need to see if the suggestion that the AI is producing is accurate and or fluent. So the linguist is going to have to be in the loop and making sure that they are checking for these things. And but they're certainly not the enemy. They're actually great productivity tools, and it's going to accelerate their process, because there is a pre-translation suggestion, and they are able to look at what is being suggested to them. Does it match all the requirements? And then move on. And we've also heard from linguists saying that they're using AI for their pre-translation research, and saying that their terminology work has become so much more precise and so much more efficient using those language models, because they're able to use prompts to basically build all the vocabulary as they're going, if those terms are not part of the glossary. And linguists also play a very important role on the becoming of LLMs, in the sense that we are working with professional linguists to evaluate the translations produced by those models, and making sure that we get to the point where they're delivering human quality translation. But that can only be achieved if you have human translators in the loop helping us evaluate. And that's when we're using the MQM framework to make sure that we are evaluating any output from an AI powered workflow, and we are able to look at what the machine is producing.
What kind of quality are we seeing right now with our MQM, with the AI-powered workflow?
Well, very reassuringly, we're seeing that those workflows produce the same high quality of translation. We're measuring monthly samples of translation, and we're seeing very, very similar scores, high scores, 98% for human translation and AI-powered translation alike. So no degradation in quality, basically.
That's great. So what I'm
Yes.
hearing is that this is, moving into the future, kind of. This is like the analogy with airplanes and autopilots, where now pilots are managing the system and not directly flying the airplane. They take over at takeoff and landing, but that's about it, right?
Yep.
Um, but we still absolutely need them there to take over in case something goes wrong.
Oh,
Do
yeah.
you see the same case with language translations right now?
Oh yeah, and I'm not traveling in an airplane without a pilot in the cockpit anytime soon. And I think that is true for translation as well. We will need for the translators for a while longer to make sure that the system is operating the way it's supposed to be, and we are delivering high quality, human-like quality translations to all our customers.
Great. Was there something else you wanted to add, Valerie?
No, just that, translators might have some trepidation when they're thinking about AI and how it would affect us. But I want to really insist on the fact that their profession is here to stay for quite a while.
Great. So we do have time for Q&A, and there are some questions in the chat. And while we're kind of on the topic of quality, I wanted to ask the question that someone asks: what metrics do you recommend for evaluating translation quality? For example, there's exact match and blue. Are there any other metrics that could be helpful in this regard?
So on our end, we are using all of the standard metrics that people are using in industry, right? We are measuring H tier, which is the churn results that we get after human edits it. So based on the suggestions from AI that they've seen, how much edit was required in order to make it into a fluent translation. That's one metric. Blue, this person already mentioned. There are also semantic metrics that we are also using to make sure that the results that's being produced by large language models is of similar meaning than the source text, for example. We're also doing other types of checks to make sure that the large language model is not hallucinating in terms of very long sentences. But in terms of semantics, that catches some hallucination as well.
Great, thank you. May, here's another question for you. You mentioned that as of now, MT and LLMs complement each other. How does that look like in day-to-day practice for translation workflow?
Oh, so for us, we have LLM power glossary insertions. So for example, when a machine translation comes back and it missed a glossary term, we can use LLMs to not only insert that glossary term, but make sure that once that glossary term is inserted, that the morphology of the sentence is still correct, right? It will adhere to the proper conjugations and inflections of the sentence once that term is introduced. So that's just one example. I mean, there are others, but I think that paints a picture pretty well.
Cool, thank you. Another question is, do you have any tips on the prompt engineering required for best results in both translation and localization?
So I think I mentioned that in the discussion already. It's that if you want the translation to tailor very specifically to your needs, you need a very specific prompt. So you need to engineer the prompt to include your linguistic assets, right? You need to know who your target audience is, what type of image are you presenting to that target audience, and make sure that the large language model knows that and can then generate a translation that adheres to that. One example that I can give, for example, is somebody being very vague, right? So for example, if somebody wants to convert their translation memory from formal Spanish to informal Spanish, there are various ways of doing it. I think in localization, most people think of it as just replacing the usted with do, and then the proper conjugations that comes with it, right? But what large language model understood it to be when you were just giving it the command of informal, for example, it goes the extra mile of making it strict slang. So it makes it super informal and no longer appropriate for that client need. It's the same way with formality. When you ask it to be very formal, sometimes the Spanish the translations that you get, it feels like, you know, this translation was generated as if you're talking to the Queen of England when you just want it in a business professional manner. So being very specific in your prompt and letting LLM know that this is, you know, for, you know, this is your target audience, like they are, I don't know, teenagers or they're business professionals, right? So that will dictate the tone that that the translation will generate from large language model. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you. A question for you, Valerie. As a LOC manager, how can I optimize our linguistic teams?
So because we have such efficiency gain, the outcome of this progress is that you're going to be able to to translate more content within the same time frame. So you don't necessarily need to increase the size of your linguist team, because they're going to be able to be more efficient. So they're going to be able to translate more in the same time. Don't go and scale down just yet. I think, you know, if you have a team that is sized properly right now, just take the opportunity to translate more volume with the team you have.
There was a question I noticed somebody was asking about the wrong words that was used in large language models, seeing that if there's a pattern or if it's random. There is a pattern, and these patterns is mostly referring to words that have multiple meanings. So for example, in the English, this is a recent translation that just happened where we're trying to translate, you know, collect some data for, you know, that's the source string. And I think in the translation of collect, it's more of a physical collecting like garbage or collecting something rather than collecting data. So when the source word is subject to multiple meanings in the target language, this is when you see the probabilistic behavior of these generative models, or these large language models, right? Because they're just generating the next token or the next word based on what's most probabilistic. And if they're seeing, you know, that garbage collection in the collecting everyday sense is more common than, for example, a very niche company that collects data or is doing that translation, they will most likely use the wrong word in that case. So that's what we're seeing.
Okay, we have another question that is, we spoke about how we evaluate linguistic quality of LLMs, but how is training an LLM different than training an MT engine?
Oh, okay, yeah. So this is, I think the difference is in the architecture of what you are fine-tuning. So it goes into more technical depth for the large language model, because there are billions and billions of parameters that is involved in terms of making this model understand the large language model. You can't tune all of the parameters. So what right now, for fine-tuning large language models, what you're doing is you're only fine-tuning the adaptive layer, which is the layer that sits on top of the what we call frozen model. So this frozen model, the underlying parameters will not change, but in the adaptive layer, based on more of the data that it's seeing from your translation memory, then it will steer it towards that, increase the probabilities of seeing that word, for example. So in that case, the data preparation will be the same, right? It will just be your translation memory. I think the only difference will be in terms of the large language models understanding, like if you need a prompt before your translation in order to generate that. So for example, if you have the same source text, but you want both the formal and the informal translation, you will have two prompts before your source text that says like translate this to formal, and then you feed it the formal translation, translate this to informal, you give it the same source text, and then it outputs the informal, right? So that's one of the differences that you will have in terms of you will have a prompt that you can also feed into your large language model in addition to your source and translation text, versus the NMT right now, where you just need to feed in your translation memory with the source and the target, and then fine tune, because that is fine. I mean, that model is built for translation. So that's all you need. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Daniel from Frankfurt has a specific question about, with German as the source language. So how would you describe the GDN LLM translation quality compared to professional translation for Chinese and Arabic languages based on either German or English-based content?
Yeah, I don't think I'm able to comment on that. I am not that fluent in German, I have to say. We are, like right now, with our internal testing with linguists and prompts, we haven't touched on German yet. We will be going there. And I think once we have that experience, I can tell you more. But at the moment, I don't think I have the answer to your question.
Do you have the answer if the source content is English, or either way? Still unclear.
Oh, so can you repeat what is?
So how would you describe the GDN LLM translation quality compared to the professional translation for Chinese and Arabic based on English content?
Professional translation, meaning a human translation, and then the other is LM. So I think we already touched upon this, where large language models at the current moment cannot generate translation of the quality where you can say, I don't need human anymore. So at the moment, professional translations are still winning. I can say that. For large language models, for certain strings, it can produce you really good translations. But again, right now we don't have the whole industry doesn't have the capability to detect whether or not this string requires a human to look at it, or the string does not require a human to look at it. Or we have that capability, but not to the extent where we can rule out all of the strings that doesn't require a human. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Yeah. So I think in conclusion, what we've learned is that even with custom trained LLMs and engines, we're still not at the point where we can fully trust it without a human in the loop. So that's where we'll leave it today, but obviously things are changing rapidly day by day. So stay tuned for the next episode of our reality series. We will send everyone a link to join that one if you're interested next month. So thank you again to everybody who attended today. And thank you so much to May and Valerie for speaking.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.